President Trump gives Hamas 48 hours to return the remaining hostage bodies or face the consequences. And just as Vice President J.D. Vance lands in Israel to keep the fragile ceasefire alive, lawmakers ignite chaos with a surprise sovereignty vote. So will the ceasefire hold, or is this just the calm before the storm? We'll be discussing all of this week's dramatic developments on today's Jerusalem Minute. Welcome back to Jerusalem Minute here on JNS TV. My name is Josh Hasten, correspondent for JNS News. We are in the JNS Media Hub in Jerusalem, the eternal capital of the state of Israel and the Jewish people, alongside Alex Traiman, CEO of JNS. Alex, President Trump on Saturday saying that Hamas needs to start returning the bodies of the deceased hostages. At this point, 13 of the remains of those who were murdered by Hamas have been returned, but they have refused to return the other bodies. What's going on here? President Trump issuing an ultimatum saying you have 48 hours to give back all the bodies.
Well, we're seeing leadership of Hamas saying, this isn't going to take weeks, this is going to take months. You have Israel saying that with the exception of just a handful of the bodies, that Hamas knows where they all are and that they should be able to return them in days. But this is Hamas really testing the willpower of Israel, testing the willpower of the United States. What they're trying to do is stress the system as much as possible in order to try to get Israel to take countermeasures, whether that's with humanitarian aid. And what that will do is that will then get more diplomatic pressure on Israel. So this is the game that Hamas plays, but thank God that they're playing this game no longer with live bodies, only with dead ones. But here, Trump stating very clearly once again that Hamas needs to live up to its commitments, and that's not only returning the dead bodies, that's also disarming.
Do we know, in terms of those dead bodies, is Hamas playing games? Do they know where they are? Are they playing games? What's going on here?
Well, I think the intelligence suggests that they do know where most of them are. That doesn't mean that they don't have to try to actually extract them from the ground. And in many of the cases where they were buried, that precise location probably has to be located, and it might be under the destroyed buildings that Israel, had to deal with inside Gaza. So it's likely that a lot of them, they do know where they are. That's the intelligence that Israel seems to have. But like we said, Hamas saying it's going to take months. So definitely a disagreement here, but it's so important for Israel to get all of these live bodies home. I don't think Israel's going to give up on this. And then the question is, who's going to go get them if Hamas is not going to do it? Will Israel be part of that force that actually goes to recover these bodies?
At the same time, President Trump has said repeatedly that Hamas must disarm. Secretary of State of the U.S., Marco Rubio, who is here in Israel, he said that Israel has met all of its ceasefire commitments, and now, per the president, Hamas must absolutely disarm moving forward.
Well, I think that we're getting to this, back to this issue. The prime minister had always said that the way you get the most concessions out of Hamas is under fire. And what the ceasefire agreement did was it basically stopped Israel from firing, and Israel's withdrawn to a position. Now, obviously, Israel still controls 50% of the strip. It's not the position that Hamas wanted, but you're definitely in a situation where Israel's no longer in the western section of Gaza, and they're not firing on Hamas. And perhaps you might have gotten more in terms of getting Hamas to give up its arms, getting Hamas leadership or those with the guns to turn them over or to take amnesty and to get out of the strip, if they were still under fire. But they're not under fire, right? So Rubio's saying that Israel's complying with its ceasefire obligations, which is important because the Western media is trying to say that both sides are. This is the narrative that's going on all the time. It's, Hamas is violating the ceasefire and Israel's doing this and this. Marco Rubio is stating very clearly, no, Israel is maintaining its obligations under the ceasefire, and that this plan does specifically call for Hamas to disarm and for Gaza to be a demilitarized zone.
We're going to talk more about Hamas and their potential role the day after, as it's known, the war. But at the same time, Rubio also said that UNRWA would not be playing a role in the future of Gaza, which is extremely significant.
UNRWA's not going to play any role in it. Okay.
UNRWA's not going to play any role
So-
in it. The UN is here. The UN is. We're seeing the work they're doing. So it's a conglomeration of about 8 to 12 groups that are here. The United Nations is here. They're on the ground. We're willing to work with them if they can make it work. But not UNRWA. UNRWA became a subsidiary of Hamas.
Well, this is important because the International Court of Justice just this week came down with a ruling stating that Israel did need to conduct humanitarian operations through UNRWA. Now, the question is, what jurisdiction does the International Court of Justice have? If the International Court of Justice is hearing cases against Israel for genocide, I mean, they ultimately didn't rule that it was a genocide, just that Israel had to take steps to ensure that it did not become a genocide, and they haven't reopened that case from what I understand, even though that might happen in the future. Israel does not honor the rulings of the International Court of Justice, doesn't believe that that's an objective body, and they should have no business stating what's going to happen inside the Gaza Strip. But Marco Rubio making it very clear the position that they see UNRWA as a subsidiary of Hamas, or maybe you could say it the other way around, that Hamas is actually a subsidiary of UNRWA, because UNRWA was the largest employer inside the Gaza Strip prior to the war, and they're part of this UN mandate, which has been just hypercritical of Israel, passing more resolutions against Israel than against all other countries, not against any other country, against all other countries. Right. And so good to hear that the United States at least doesn't want to see UNRWA being rebuilt inside the Gaza Strip, or them having any role whatsoever. And now what we have to do is make sure that Hamas doesn't have a role either.
I've said it from the beginning, UNRWA is Hamas, but I want to talk about this back-to-back-to-back diplomacy taking place here. Marco Rubio in town, Vice President of the U.S. J.D. Vance just left a couple of days ago. Let's go to this video of the Vice President here in Israel.
What we've seen the past week gives me great optimism the ceasefire is going to hold. And if we get from where we were a week ago to a long-term, durable peace between Israel and Gaza, there are going to be hills and valleys. There are going to be moments where it looks like things aren't going particularly well. But given that, and given the history of conflict, I think that everybody should be proud of where we are today. Right now, I feel very optimistic. Can I say with 100% certainty that it's going to work? No. But you don't do difficult things by only doing what's 100% certain. You do difficult things by trying, and that's what the President of the United States has asked us to do.
So Vice President Vance optimistic that the ceasefire is going to hold. That being said, by the way, yesterday the IDF struck terror targets in central Gaza, taking out, from what we know, at least one terrorist. Similar to the situation in the north with Hezbollah, if Israel sees a ticking time bomb, somebody about to carry out an attack against Israeli troops or perhaps Israeli civilians, Israel has the right to strike even with a ceasefire in place.
Well, we're definitely on a bit of a diplomatic roller coaster here. We signed the deal. President Trump came. We got the hostages back, and I think everybody in Israel felt very, very good about the situation. There's exuberance to see the hostages back. We heard President Trump's speech in the parliament. You couldn't have had a more pro-Israel speech. He blessed the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob from our parliament on our holiday. Talked about how Netanyahu was a winner, the bravery of the IDF soldiers, how important it was to get the hostages back. And everybody felt pretty good about it, even if we had to swallow this bitter pill as we released 250 Palestinian terrorists from the Israeli jails who were sitting there because they committed murder, in addition to the other 1,700 that we arrested during the war in Gaza that we gave back. So people, even though there was a bitter pill, people were feeling pretty good. And then all of a sudden, J.D. Vance comes, and people wondering, why does J.D. Vance need to come just a few days later? Apparently, he wanted to see what was going on with his own eyes. He hasn't been one of the key diplomats working in the area. Those have been Rubio, Kushner, Witkoff, but then Vance comes in, and Vance gives a press conference, and he says a few things which I think gave some Israelis pause. Like on the one, he said, these are two peoples that hate each other, and I think, it's not right to say that this is a conflict of two peoples that have always hated each other. I mean, Israel has always been suspicious of the Palestinians, for sure, because they don't have the same worldview as the Israelis. But Israelis have been willing to live side by side in peace, and even been willing to cede land in order to get to peace. That's why we pulled out of the Gaza Strip, in order to give the Palestinians a piece of land that they could work with and try to make a better future for their own people. But the Gazan people, what do? They voted for a terrorist organization, Hamas, which has in its the charter document of Hamas calls for the annihilation of the state of Israel. Okay, so this isn't two peoples that hate each other. This is like one nation that's trying to figure out how to live in a difficult neighborhood versus another nation that sees its purpose as trying to destroy Israel. And the only difference really between Hamas on the extreme side is that they openly call for the direct annihilation of Israel. And then you have the Palestinian Authority, which says that the path towards the annihilation of Israel is first to take what we can get, which is half of the country for a two-state solution, and then we'll worry about the other half, through the right of return and other things. So, I just think that that's like a false paradigm that Vance put out there. And again, when we had Trump, blessing the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob, what that means is that the way that the Jewish people look up to God, that's the way in which Trump wanted to bless the Jewish people. And we know that when Trump came here on his first visit, he went to the Western Wall. When Rubio came here on his first visit, he went to the Western Wall. Now, Vance has been to the Western Wall in the past, but when he came as vice president now on this trip, he said that he was going to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre.
Right.
Which is just meters away from the Western Wall, but opted not to go to the Western Wall. And he also talked about how Jesus was called the Prince of Peace. Now, that's fine. Okay, I understand that. He said as a Christian, the land is very important to him, but also in terms of just the protocols that all world leaders and diplomats are trained, that when you come to Israel, that the Jewish people, we don't hold Jesus as part of our testament. It's just not part of our beliefs and value system. And that American diplomats, when they come, they're not supposed to talk about that in public press conferences, but Vance did. And I think it's a bit of a signal. But then you also saw how, and we'll talk about this in a minute, when Israel, its parliament voted on questions of sovereignty throughout all of Judea and Samaria, and particularly in Ma'ale Adumim, which is one of the largest cities actually in Judea, in the Judean mountains, that, he said, if that's a political stunt, it's a pretty stupid one. And then he said he was personally offended by it.
When I asked about it, somebody told me that it was a political stunt, that it had no practical significance. It was purely symbolic. I mean, look, if it was a political stunt, it was a very stupid political stunt, and I personally take some insult to it. The West Bank is not going to be annexed by Israel. The policy of the Trump administration is that the West Bank will not be annexed by Israel. That will continue to be our policy. And if people want to take symbolic votes, they can do that. But we certainly weren't happy about it.
For the vice president to come here and say that he was personally offended when, we see the things that Hamas says, even when the Saudis are talking about normalizing with Israel, they also talk about a Palestinian state, on the 67 lines. I mean, that's very offensive to Israelis. But we don't say that everything that everybody said is offensive to us. So the fact that he's showing that he was personally offended, there's a lot of different questions about, whether Vance's visit went as well as Trump's visit. So first we had Trump's visit. We felt good about it. Vance's visit came and went. I think the hope here among Israelis is that Vance is really not the one guiding the policy here moving forward, that's more in the hands of Marco Rubio, who's now here and now saying all the right things on his trip. But I think it's also a bit of a cautionary warning, because there's a strong possibility that J.D. Vance is going to be the next Republican candidate for president, nominee for president of the United States. And a big question mark as to whether J.D. Vance will be as friendly to the state of Israel as the current president, Donald Trump.
Yeah, I would say definitely a cause for concern, especially what you said, comparing the two people, saying they've hated each other. I mean, that's like comparing the criminal to the cop. You just don't do that. There's a difference between Hamas and the state of Israel. But in terms of the background on that sovereignty bill, on Wednesday, Israeli lawmakers passed a preliminary reading to extend legal sovereignty over Judea and Samaria. Now, a lot of people would argue this was just a political stunt to make Prime Minister Netanyahu look bad, because in reality, the Prime Minister said he supports sovereignty over Judea and Samaria. But that being said, the opposition and others trying to pass this bill, especially when J.D. Vance was here in town in order to make Prime Minister Netanyahu look bad. And in fact, Prime Minister Netanyahu went on to X and said basically that this was just a stunt. Yes, he supports sovereignty, but that being said, the timing was off, trying to hurt the coalition there.
Well, I do think that it was a stunt, and I do think I kind of agree with Vance in the sense that it was a political stunt, but not from the point of view of Vance. I think it was actually a poor stunt from the point of view of those that actually support sovereignty
Right.
in Judea and Samaria, because what you've done here by bringing this resolution as the vice president was here, as the ceasefire is just beginning to take hold, as the president is talking about rushing towards normalization agreements, but knowing full well that advancing sovereignty in this particular moment in time is going to stall negotiations for normalization agreements, that it wasn't good timing. And the prime minister, I'm not sure if the prime minister is a big supporter of sovereignty. I think he's a supporter of some sort of limited sovereignty, but he would only want to do that with the full backing of the United States. He would not buck the will of President Trump in order to race ahead with sovereignty in Judea and Samaria. This is not the way that the prime minister is going to operate. Now, the prime minister said after the fact that this was a bill that was brought up by members of the opposition.
Right.
But we see that there were some members of the coalition, in fact, that did vote for it. Now, we saw that the bills passed. One of the bills passed 25 to 24. Okay, now if you do the math here, you know that the parliament has 120 people. Okay, so a bill on such a serious issue as whether Israel will extend its sovereignty in Judea and Samaria. I mean, this is not a bill that would need to pass with 25 votes. But the fact now that you had the president of the United States, having to respond to this, saying that Israel is not going to annex or apply its sovereignty in Judea and Samaria, and seeing Vance refer to it as the West Bank, and President Trump referring to it as the West Bank. Now, I think that really slams the brakes on what was a lot of positive momentum towards sovereignty. So I think the fact that you would see Israelis that either they're so obtuse that they don't understand how this could damage the relationship between Israel and the United States, because it foments distrust between the two administrations, which have been working so closely together on the ceasefire, on the Iran operation back in June, July. So the last thing you want to do when you're working so well with a partner is to foment distrust. And I think that either Israelis that were part of this bill didn't understand that they were sowing distrust, and then that just shows how far they are from being able to actually run this country. And I know that there's people on the right, that think that the right should run the country and that Bibi's not, right wing enough. But Netanyahu is sophisticated, and you see that there's a lack of sophistication from those that voted for this. But then there's also those that did understand that this would cause a rift between Trump and Netanyahu. And the fact that you would have members of the Knesset that would go so far as to openly cause like a wound or a damage to the relationship between Trump and Netanyahu because they understand that we're going towards an election season and they don't want to see Netanyahu be reelected, that they would get Trump mad at Israel because of that. I mean, how stupid can you be? I
don't think they're stupid. This was deliberately trying to put the prime minister in a corner, trying to make him look bad. And
this is cutting off your nose.
Yeah, absolutely. To upset all the momentum that's going until now for your own political needs instead of looking out for the good of the country is
again, it's my fear
reprehensible.
It's my fear that this did not set back the movement for sovereignty. Because
sure.
Ultimately, sovereignty is in the direct essential interest of the Jewish people. Jews are called Jews because they come from Judea. We're not here only for Tel Aviv. We're here for all the biblical locations that we're reading about these weeks, which are all located in Judea and Samaria. So you don't want to see any kind of setback there, and you never want to use your sovereignty, as a political football. And I was upset when the prime minister did it, when he talked about annexing the Jordan Valley in one of the election campaigns, and then came back on his promise because that's what he felt he needed to do in order to make a normalization agreement with Bahrain and the United Arab Emirates. You don't put your sovereignty into the marketplace. You don't use your sovereignty as a political football, not for those that want to take sovereignty out and not for those that want to put sovereignty in. This is not a political football issue. This is an essential issue, and it needs to be treated only with seriousness and with partnership.
Absolutely, I agree. I always say that sovereignty and these issues of building in Judea and Samaria should not be seen as a political game or, let's say, a punishment towards the Arabs for their behavior. It should just be done because it's the right thing to do. I've said that time and time again. We'll see how this plays out. But turning to normalization, which you mentioned, Finance Minister Bezalel Smotrich causing some commotion in terms of statements he made regarding normalization of Saudi Arabia versus sovereignty. And let's check out the video of Bezalel Smotrich.
אם סעודיה אומרת לנו נורמליזציה בתמורה למדינה פלסטינית, חברים, לא תודה, תמשיכו לרכב על גמלים על החול במדבר בסעודיה, אנחנו נמשיך להתפתח באמת עם כלכלה וחברה ומדינה ואת כל הדברים הגדולים והנהדרים שאנחנו יודעים לעשות.
So here he is saying that if normalization with Saudi Arabia means we're going to have a Palestinian state or we're not going to implement sovereignty, no thank you. He said to the Saudis, keep riding camels in the desert, which a lot of people found disparaging. He later apologized for those comments, said he didn't mean what he said after he was denounced from all over the place. But let's talk about Bezalel Smotrich and his comments there in regard to Saudi Arabia.
Right. I mean, he did apologize. He said that his statement was not successful and that he regret the offense it caused. However, at the same time, I expect the Saudis not to offend us by denying our connection to our historical homeland. And I think that we're seeing the Arab world, especially, they're talking a lot about the creation of a Palestinian state. Certainly Western Europe, the UK, France, others talking about the creation of a Palestinian state. And in a way, when you look at the sovereignty bill that we were just talking about, I mean, that's a direct response to all the talk about a Palestinian state. And perhaps we can make some kind of arrangement right now that if people don't want to hear Israel pushing the sovereignty at this moment in time, right, just at this moment, and they don't want to see sovereignty bills, and they don't want us to be talking openly about applying our sovereignty in Judea and Samaria, well, maybe they can calm down on all their talk about a Palestinian state. I mean, these two things go together. You have a choice. You can either have Israeli sovereignty, you can have a Palestinian state, or you can have the status quo, okay? Now, people want a Palestinian state. Israel's not going to do that. That's just not going to happen. Palestinian state is not going to be a reward for the most heinous terror massacre. I mean, the formula that we first entered into, which was the guiding framework toward a Palestinian state, was the Oslo Accords, and the framework was called Land for Peace, okay? It's not called Land for Massacre, right? That's exactly what Israel is afraid of. When Israel said that they were going to withdraw from the Gaza Strip in 2005, Israel said, how can you do that? And what did we see that they did with the land? They turned it into Gaza. They turned it into this hellhole, which had a whole network of tunnels with thousands and tens of thousands of rockets, and was used as a launching pad for continuous attacks against Israel. Israel believes, and rightly so, that if there's going to be a Palestinian state in Judea and Samaria, that it's going to look like Gaza looked, on October 6th and October 7th, 2023. And they're totally right. And they don't have any reason to believe otherwise. So, if countries are going to continue to talk about Palestinian state, what they're going to get in return is talk about sovereignty. And if they don't want Israel to talk about sovereignty, maybe they should stop talking so much about the creation of a Palestinian state.
By the way, in terms of Smotrich, this past Friday in synagogues across the country, his party distributed literature indicating how much he has accomplished as being a minister in the defense ministry as well, in terms of building approvals, all sorts of accomplishments in Judea and Samaria. So that should be noted as well. We mentioned before about Hamas and whether or not they will stay in power the day after the war. You had Arab affairs commentator, expert Tzvi Cheskeli warning that the Trump administration, with the mediators, specifically Witkoff and Kushner, they're about to bring about a situation in which Hamas will remain in power in Gaza. Then you had an article in the Wall Street Journal saying that the current plan, the Israeli plan, being advanced by Kushner, Witkoff, and the administration, is to divide Gaza into two sections, one controlled by Israel, the other by Hamas, and starting to develop the Israeli part while not rebuilding the Hamas part. So how much do we know about the plan, according to the Wall Street Journal, in which Hamas is, in fact, responsible for parts of Gaza when the war is finally declared over?
At present, Israel controls the eastern section of Gaza. They control 53% of the territory. They also control the southern border with Egypt. They also control the northern border that also borders against Israel. Hamas, they're on the shore, basically, but it's a no man's land. It's not that Hamas owns the territory, controls the territory, but there is right now a major power struggle taking place in those areas. And I think what you're going to see is that Israel is not going to back up one more inch off of the yellow line as long as Hamas is still active and militant inside the area where the IDF does not control in Gaza. And what you're going to see also is that any rebuilding is only going to take part in the areas that the IDF controls. In addition to that, I don't think that that Hamas controls all of that territory on the western coast. And there are clans that are controlling parts of that territory. So what you're actually having now is a situation in which the centers of control are being formalized in some way, shape, or form. And Hamas, they may emerge as being in control of a certain area, but they're being isolated to a certain area. And what will happen later is that if they continue to act in a way which is militant, if they continue to be arms out on the street, if they continue to open fire, what you're going to see then is that it's going to be a lot easier for the IDF to go into those isolated areas and to finish the job in those areas in which Hamas has been consolidated.
Alex, we're almost out of time, but I think it's important to note that the winter session of the Israeli parliament, the Knesset, just started several days ago. Prime Minister Netanyahu telling the Knesset that the Jewish state had emerged stronger than ever from 2 years of war, saying that his determined and courageous decisions helped cement Jerusalem's status as a regional power and deal a decisive blow to Iran. At the same time, there is a lot of talk about what is going to happen in regard to a future Israeli election, if it's going to happen now, in the next 90 days, 120 days, if it's going to hold out and we're going to have elections as scheduled at the end of 2026. Also, a lot of talk about the situation involving the ultra-Orthodox and they're being drafted into the Israeli military, bills on the slate. Overall, what can we expect from this Knesset session? It seems like it's going to be a pretty important one here in terms of where Israel is at this juncture, 2 years into this war.
Well, the prime minister has said repeatedly over the last week or so that elections are not going to be held early. They're going to take place as scheduled at the end of the term, which is going to be at the end of 2026, basically like about 1 year from today. And there's a lot of reasons why it could be beneficial for the prime minister to call an early election. Number one, because you've reached a ceasefire, you brought back the living hostages, and there does need to be a return of the mandate at a certain point. And Israelis should get to choose who will be their leadership in this post-war environment. And certainly the prime minister has made it clear that he's going to run again. Another advantage of a snap election is that the election season will be contained to 90 days. And I think that this is going to be a bitter and a painful election for Israel because all of the pain of October 7th is going to be wrapped into it. Certainly you see that whole movement, which has most recently been the hostage forum movement. But before that was the Kaplan Force against the judicial reform. That before that was the Prime Minister anti-Netanyahu movement. It's all the same movement.
And they're still protesting.
They're
Saturday
still protesting
nights.
now.
Yeah.
They're still protesting Saturday nights. You know, they're going to try to build as much momentum, against Netanyahu, against the right wing as they can ahead of an election. So, ripping the Band-Aid off and doing it as quickly as possible might be to the benefit of Israelis. And if this is only going to happen in a year, what you're basically doing is announcing that we're in a year-long election cycle. And it does feel like that's happening. Right. And there is a sense, my sense is that it's not going to be a time of internal unity. It's going to be a time of discord and very ugly statements from politicians and protests and roadblockings and all that bad energy that we had in the months that led up to October 7th, that we could actually regurgitate that in a nasty way. But at the same time, there's a couple of reasons why it might not be in the best interest of the members of the coalition, including Prime Minister, to go to an election now. And you mentioned the bill that would call for the conscription of the ultra-Orthodox into the military. Now, if there's an election and there's another government, you can be sure that whatever bill gets passed is going to be less gentle than the bill that the current coalition is working on. And there was just recently a change made at the head of the Military and Foreign Affairs Committee, and Boaz Bismuth is now the head of that committee instead of Yuli Edelstein, who was, putting a harsher bill. The Bismuth bill is a lot more sensitive and gives, some time to ramp up the enlistment of the religious to the military. And I think that will be actually has the chances to be more successful, because you can't just change status quo like with a sledgehammer. You have to do things in a gentle way, and also give the military time to figure out how to actually absorb them in a successful way, because you don't just want them to walk in the door and enlist. You want them to ultimately integrate successfully into the military, and that's going to mean the creation of all kind of functionalities, and it's going to have to be done strategically. So the ultra-Orthodox, who are members of the coalition, they want this bill to be passed. They want it to be implemented by this government. So they don't really have an incentive to go to an election. At the same time, for Prime Minister Netanyahu, right now he's working with President Trump. It seems that President Trump is insistent that he wants to see this ceasefire hold. That's important for him. And he also wants to get these normalization bills rolling as fast as possible. If you go to an election, as we saw in the previous Trump administration, when we were going through election after election after election, these countries, they don't know who they're signing a deal with, and it actually slows the process down. And I think that for President Trump, he might say, hey, we've got a year, we can do a lot in a year. Don't cause a major interruption by going now to an election. Let's see what we can get done in this period. So I think that there is reasons to suspect that the prime minister will try to hang on to his government as long as possible, and to only call an election as scheduled at the end of next year.
Alex, I'm pretty sure this is accurate. In 78 years of the modern state of Israel, only 4 governments have lasted a full term. If you're out there watching, you can go out and Google and try to prove me wrong or prove me right. I think it's only 4 times, one of those under Prime Minister Netanyahu. Let's see if that happens again.
Yeah, and that's not to say that this government has been a fully functional or an ideal government. I don't think it has for a lot of different reasons. And I'm not certain, by the way, that if Netanyahu is victorious come another election, that he will form the same government once again. I think that if he had an opportunity, as he has done in the past, to govern from the center, he might do that. And you might actually find a better functioning government. At the same time, it will be a less stable government, because ultimately the left wing wants to get Netanyahu out of office. It's only this right wing that's willing to keep Netanyahu in office. And there is a sort of like ideological alignment here, but it doesn't mean that it functions properly. So on the one hand, stable, on the other hand, a little bit dysfunctional. On the other hand, all Israeli governments by their nature are a bit dysfunctional. And you certainly also have a lot of people here, looking at the political map and just not happy overall. I mean, even if they think that Netanyahu is the best choice in this moment and Israel doesn't have another choice, they want to see something different in the Knesset, and that probably means that they're looking to see 120 new Knesset members, or a reform of the political system, so you don't have this unstable parliamentary system, and you might have term limits, and you might have judicial reforms, and you might have regional representation, all things that you don't currently have. Okay, and it's likely that there is going to be a political revolution that takes place, but it's doubtful that that's all going to happen before the upcoming election.
And we will pay close attention to this current winter session in the Knesset and keep everyone out there updated. Alex, have a great week, and we'll see you next week on Jerusalem Minute. Just give a shout out to everyone behind the scenes here: Ryan Lifshitz, Zach Sickerman, Esther Eden, and Yuri Svertsky. Make sure you go to JNS TV for all the latest amazing content that JNS has to offer, and go to jns.org for the latest breaking news from Israel, the Middle East, and the entire Jewish world. See you next week on Jerusalem Minute. Have a great week.